This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 6, the Civil Rights Movement, with the section beginning with the 24th Amendment. In January of 1964, even before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, Congress had approved, and then 3/4 of the states passed, the 24th Amendment, outlawing poll taxes in any federal election. Poll taxes had been one of the ways that poor people in the South, and especially poor black people in the South, had been denied the right to vote. That the argument went that elections were expensive. In order to pay for an election, everybody who voted had to pay a tax. Those were outlawed constitutionally by the passage of the 24th Amendment. Because the next kind of big thing in the civil rights movement, now that legal equality has been established throughout the United States, the next thing that had to happen was all of America's blacks in the South had to register to vote so they could actually use this political and legal equality. And so what you got in the summer of 1964 was known as the Freedom Summer. As the Civil Rights Bill is being passed, the fact did still remain that few blacks were registered to vote down south. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and simple intimidation prevented, large, huge numbers of black Americans from exercising the rights that they had under the 14th and 15th Amendment and were about to codify in the civil rights election. Only 5% of blacks in Mississippi were even registered to vote, just as one example. So in the summer of 1964, black volunteers and white volunteers from the North and the South joined forces in a massive Southern voter registration drive. This was an optimistic time that, King had delivered his speech, the law was going to be passed, volunteers are registering blacks to vote, down south. People are starting to imagine that America's racial problems are going to fade quietly away into the night. But the racists of the South are not going to go so quietly. In the summer of 1964, people working for this Freedom Summer campaign, 3 of them, 2 white people and a black person from Chicago, were murdered by a Mississippi mob. Instead of the President Johnson, instead of letting local authorities take care of the issue, Johnson sent the FBI. And the FBI arrested 21 people, including the local sheriff, who was involved with the Klan and involved in the murder of these 3 men. They were put on trial, but a jury of their peers refused to convict them. That although the evidence was overwhelming, the jury down in Mississippi, on which blacks could not serve, refused to convict the perpetrators of this awful, awful crime. In 2001, one of the people involved in it, this old man by 2001, was finally put back on trial and he was convicted, and this old man is spending the rest of his life behind bars now. But America's racial problems are not going away that easily, like a lot of people hoped. So Martin Luther King decided to march again. And this time, Martin Luther King was going to march for voting rights among the South. He pretty much leaves Washington after getting the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 signed and heads back down to organize blacks to vote. And he organized a march from Selma in Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. In the city, he chose Selma. Selma was a city in which only 1% of the blacks were registered to vote, despite being 50% of the population. King's peaceful march from Selma to Montgomery is violently assaulted by Alabama state troopers who killed a minister. Later that night, a white civil rights worker is gunned down by the Klan. The North and many Southerners are appalled disturbed by the news that, a lot of people had bought into the optimism. And the march, had been violently attacked by the government of the state of Alabama. And people, again, they had just watched the news, they had seen the Civil Rights Bill pass, And now they watch the news again, and they see that still there are more problems down south, that people are still being attacked for trying to exercise their constitutional rights. President Johnson takes this opportunity to go on television. And he's a Southerner. Johnson is a Texan from West Texas, one of the most conservative parts of the whole country. And Johnson, complete with his Southern accent, and he had a Southern accent, and he especially deployed his Southern accent when it benefited him. President Johnson went on television and told the American people that all Americans had to confront America's bigoted past, and that Americans couldn't hide from that fact. And in fact, Americans had to stop hiding from the fact that we do have a bigoted past in this country and help to fix the problem. And Johnson himself was as good as his word. He pushed through the fourth and final of his Great Society programs, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed grandfather clauses, outlawed literacy tests, poll taxes had already been outlawed. It provided for hundreds of federal voter registrars. Now the government itself was sending people down south to register blacks to vote. It was no longer dependent on the black citizens themselves or on volunteers. Hundreds of people who were at government jobs, it was their government job to go and register black citizens down south. Hundreds of federal marshals went with them to protect them from being assaulted by any Southerners who still wished to try to prevent the progress of time from going on. So Johnson's as good as his word, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is another incredibly important piece of social legislation. And unlike some legislation during Reconstruction or even during Eisenhower and Kennedy's time, that Johnson backed up his legislation with teeth. That the registrars went down there, marshals went down, that another part of the Voting Rights Act was the states down south could not even pass election laws without consent of the federal government. So Johnson was as good as his word when he went on television and told the American people that it was high time to confront this past of bigotry and racism, and to combat it and to actively work against it. And Johnson did just that.